Hi everyone, my name is Katrina McPherson and I'm excited to show you the books I have chosen for our diversity book presentation. The first book is called The Name Jar. The author is Yang Suk Koi and the age range is 3 to 7 years. However, I could see this book being used in upper elementary grades and I think it would still be very beneficial and have great meaning to those children as well. This story is about a new kid at school, Yoonhae. Well, Yoonhae has recently moved to America from Korea. And being the new kid at school, she's already nervous about kids liking her. But what makes it so difficult is that her name is hard to pronounce. So Yoonhae quickly becomes concerned that her classmates will not be accepting of her. So instead of introducing herself, she then tells her classmates she has not picked a name yet. Her classmates are fascinated to think that someone has no name, so they begin making suggestions for her and filling a glass jar with those names. Yoonhae practices using those names to introduce herself with at home, and later on in the story, she has a friend who finds out what her real name is and that her name actually has a special meaning. On the day Yoonhae comes to school to tell her classmates her name, this jar has mysteriously disappeared, and Yoonhae then decides to tell her classmates her real name. And her classmates ended up being really excited about it and thought it was neat that she had a name that had a special meaning. So in this story, it teaches children to take pride in their differences and how their name basically makes up their identity. In these illustrations, the top one shows Yoonhae on the bus on her way to school the very first day. And this is kind of the moment where she decides that she doesn't want to introduce herself to her classmates as Yoonhae because the children on the bus had a difficult time pronouncing her name and she became embarrassed. The bottom picture is Yoonhae's classmates coming up with name suggestions and putting it in the jar. For my activity, I found one where students actually take home a questionnaire for their parents and it asks them like how they chose their name and does it have a special meaning. And after they get their response, they come back to school and they write about why their name is special or why it's important. And then, as you can see in the image, they have different ways of writing their name around their actual writing of why it's important. And then the teacher displayed all of their names on a board, which I think is a great way to build class community. The second book I chose is called Whoever You Are by Mem Fox. The age range is 4 to 7 years. And in this story, it's about children who live all over the world from many different cultures. And in the story, children are laughing, they're crying, they're playing, they're eating, sleeping, learning. And in the story, it talks about how they may not all look the same or they may not speak the same language, but inside that we're all very much alike. So the story teaches students that there are many cultures, and regardless of their culture, we all are very much alike, even though we have many differences. In these illustrations, the first one points out how some ways we may be different. For example, it tells children that our skin might be a different color or how our homes might be different. And then in the bottom illustration, it tells how we are like. For example, like we all smile and we all laugh. For the activity, the teacher first begins by facilitating a discussion with the students about what makes them the same and then what makes them different. And after students have had time to share those differences and similarities with each other, they take turns making their hands on paper to be cut out and used as a display. And as you can see in the image, she put them around the world. So it's a great visual to them to see that in this world we're all different, but we're all the same on the inside. We're all still human beings. The third book I chose is called A Friend Like Simon. The author is Kate Gaynor, and the age range is 4 to 8 years. The summary of the story, it's about a child named Simon who moves to a mainstream school and he has autism. And in the beginning of the story, Matthew befriends Simon, and as the story continues on and he sees that Simon is very different from him, he starts to wonder if he really wants to have a friend like Simon because he doesn't understand some of the things that Simon does. But as the story goes on, he figures out that it is good to have friends that are different from us. And there's a turning point where he realizes that Simon might be different, but he still has something to offer. And Matthew ends up staying friends with Simon. And so in the story, it teaches students that it's okay to have friends that are different from us and to be accepting of those differences. In these two illustrations, the first one is showing on top, the top image shows that Matthew's trying to decide if he really wants to be friends with Simon, and he feels like he's being forced because the teacher asked him to sit with Simon on the bus on their way to a field trip. But in the bottom image, Simon shares his lunch with Matthew, and he just has a moment where he shows how loving and kind he is. And at that moment, Matthew realizes that even though Simon is different, he is still a good person and has things to offer as a friend. So for the hands-on activity, it would start with a discussion where students name things that are the same about them and their friends, and then they talk about how they are different from their friends. Then the discussion leads to, why is it good to have friends who are different from us? And then the students are able to, whichever friend they describe, they draw a picture of themselves and the friend that they decided to compare and contrast themselves to. And then in the picture, next to the picture, they can write about those things that make them the same and different and why it's good to have that friend that's different from us. All of these are great books, and I actually had a really hard time picking because there are so many great ones out there. But thank you for listening to my presentation.